The sky was painted with streaks of orange and crimson as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the narrow streets of the old town. Ratna, a young woman in her late 20s, was strolling through the town's infamous night market. Known for its antique shops and oddities, the market was a labyrinth of shadowy alleys, dimly lit by flickering lanterns. Ratna had always been fascinated by vintage items, things with history, with stories. That night, her curiosity led her deeper into the market than she had ever ventured before. She passed vendors selling faded books, rusted trinkets, and peculiar artifacts, but none of them caught her attention. As she turned a corner, a small, decrepit stall came into view. It was different from the others, isolated, shrouded in darkness, and manned by an old woman with piercing eyes. The woman sat silently behind her table, her gnarled fingers tracing the edge of a porcelain doll that sat before her. The doll was unlike anything Ratna had ever seen. Its pale face was cracked, giving the appearance of a broken mask. The eyes were made of glass, unnervingly lifelike, and seemed to follow her every move. It wore a tattered white dress stained with what looked like old, dried rust. Despite its condition, there was an inexplicable allure to the doll that Ratna couldn't ignore. "Do you like her?" the old woman's voice croaked, startling Ratna. I don't know," Ratna admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "She's strange." The old woman chuckled darkly. "Strange, yes. Beautiful too, isn't she? But be warned, this doll is not for the faint of heart." Ratna frowned, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" The woman leaned closer, her expression grave. "This doll has a history. It once belonged to a young girl who died tragically. Her soul, they say, never left. She's a restless one, searching for something." Ratna hesitated. Her rational mind told her to walk away, but something deeper, perhaps a mix of intrigue and an odd sense of connection, compelled her to stay. "How much?" she asked. The old woman's lips curled into a faint smile. "She's yours, if you dare take her. No price. Just know that once you accept her, she'll be with you, always." Ignoring the ominous tone, Ratna reached for the doll, her fingers brushing against its cold porcelain skin. A sudden chill ran down her spine, but she shook it off. "I'll take her," Ratna said firmly. The old woman nodded silently and handed over the doll. As Ratna turned to leave, she thought she heard the woman mutter something under her breath. The words were indistinct, but they sent a shiver through her nonetheless. Ratna returned to her small apartment on the outskirts of the city, carrying the doll wrapped in an old cloth. The chill of the market still lingered in her bones, but she dismissed it as the cool night air. Her apartment was modest, filled with an eclectic mix of vintage furniture and trinkets she had collected over the years. She placed the doll on a wooden shelf near her desk, where it sat stiffly, its glassy eyes catching the dim light from the overhead lamp. As the hours passed, Ratna began to feel uneasy. Though the doll remained motionless, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her. She told herself it was just her imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by the old woman's unsettling story. Later that night, as she prepared for bed, Ratna glanced at the doll one last time. Its expression seemed to have shifted ever so slightly. The cracks on its face appeared deeper, and its eyes seemed brighter, almost alive. She blinked hard, shook her head, and climbed into bed. The first night passed uneventfully, though her dreams were filled with strange images, of a young girl crying, of dark, endless corridors, and of whispers she couldn't understand. She woke up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding. The next morning, Ratna shrugged off her uneasy sleep and went about her day. She worked from home as an illustrator, often spending hours at her desk sketching designs for clients. But as she sat down to work, she noticed something odd. The doll, which she had left on the shelf, was now sitting on her desk. She froze, her pencil slipping from her fingers. "Did I move you?" she muttered to herself, trying to recall if she had touched the doll before bed. She couldn't remember. Hesitant but trying to rationalize it, she picked up the doll and placed it back on the shelf. Hours later, as she returned to her desk after a lunch break, she found the doll once again sitting there, its head tilted slightly to the side as if watching her. A chill ran down her spine. This time, she was sure she hadn't moved it. "Okay, this is weird," Ratna said aloud, her voice shaky. She grabbed the doll, wrapped it in the cloth it had come with, and stuffed it into a wooden chest in her closet. Out of sight, out of mind, she thought. But that night, things took a darker turn. As Ratna lay in bed, the faint sound of whispers filled the room. At first, she thought it was coming from outside, the murmur of neighbors or the hum of the city. But as she strained to listen, she realized the whispers were coming from within her apartment. She sat up, her heart pounding. The sound was faint but persistent, like a child murmuring in a language she couldn't understand. It seemed to be coming from the closet. Summoning her courage, Ratna grabbed her phone and turned on its flashlight. She tiptoed toward the closet, each step feeling heavier than the last. The whispers grew louder as she approached. With trembling hands, she opened the closet door. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. The chest where she had hidden the doll was slightly ajar. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. She hadn't left it like that. She was certain. She hesitated for a moment before slowly lifting the lid. The doll was no longer wrapped in the cloth. It sat upright in the chest, its head tilted, its glassy eyes staring straight at her. Ratna stumbled back, nearly dropping her phone. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. "I'm imagining this," she whispered to herself. "It's just stress. It's nothing." But deep down, she knew it wasn't nothing. Over the next few days, the doll's presence became more menacing. Ratna would find it in different places around her apartment, on the kitchen counter, on her bed, even perched on the edge of the bathtub. Each time, she would lock it away, only for it to reappear hours later, its expression seeming to grow more sinister. The whispers returned as well, growing louder and more distinct. Ratna began to hear fragments of words, her name, spoken in a soft, chilling voice, followed by eerie laughter. She tried to get rid of the doll. One night, she drove to a nearby river and threw it into the water, watching as it sank beneath the surface. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of relief. But when she returned home, the doll was sitting on her bed, its dress still damp, its glassy eyes gleaming in the moonlight. The doll sat on her bed, water dripping from its tattered dress onto the wooden floor. Ratna's breath caught in her throat as she stared at it, her mind racing to make sense of what she was seeing. She had thrown it into the river, she was certain of it. Her hands had released it into the cold, dark water, and she had watched it sink. But here it was, sitting upright, as if it had never left her apartment. Her chest tightened with panic, and her knees felt weak. She approached the doll cautiously, each step slower than the last. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with something unseen. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. Reaching out with trembling hands, she picked up the doll. It was colder than before, the porcelain face slick with water. Its glassy eyes seemed to gleam with malice. "What do you want from me?" Ratna whispered, her voice cracking. The doll, of course, did not answer. She wrapped it in a towel and shoved it into a cardboard box, sealing the lid with tape. This time, she wasn't taking any chances. She left her apartment in the middle of the night and drove to the outskirts of the city, where an old abandoned landfill lay hidden among the trees. With the box in her hands, she climbed over the rusted fence and made her way into the heart of the landfill. She found an open pit and tossed the box in, watching it tumble down into the darkness. For good measure, she grabbed handfuls of dirt and debris, covering the pit until the box was no longer visible. When she finally returned home, exhaustion overtook her. She collapsed onto her bed, her body trembling with relief. It was over, she told herself. The doll was gone, but deep down a small, nagging voice whispered otherwise. The next morning, Ratna woke to the sound of something thudding softly against her bedroom door. She sat up, her heart pounding. The sound came again, a rhythmic tapping, like knuckles rapping lightly on wood. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet touching the cold floor. Her eyes darted to the door, where the sound continued, steady and unrelenting. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The tapping stopped. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then slowly the door creaked open. Ratna held her breath, her eyes fixed on the widening gap. As the door swung fully open, she saw it. The doll stood in the doorway, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its glass eyes staring directly at her. Its dress, still damp and stained with mud, clung to its tiny frame. Ratna screamed. The doll moved. It took a single step forward, its tiny porcelain foot tapping against the floor. Ratna scrambled backward, falling off the bed and landing hard on the floor. "Stay away!" she shouted, her voice breaking. The doll took another step, and then another, its movements slow and deliberate. The room grew colder with each step, the air thick with an oppressive energy that pressed down on her chest. Ratna scrambled to her feet and bolted for the door, pushing past the doll and running into the hallway. She didn't stop until she reached the front door of her apartment. She yanked it open and ran into the street, her breath coming in ragged gasps. For hours, she wandered the streets, unsure of where to go or what to do. She couldn't go back. Not with that thing in her apartment. Eventually, she found herself outside the home of her best friend, Maya. Desperate and shaking, she knocked on the door until Maya answered. "Ratna? What's wrong?" Maya asked, her face filled with concern. "There's something in my apartment," Ratna said, her voice trembling. "A doll. It's alive." Maya frowned. "A doll? What are you talking about?" "I can't explain it," Ratna said. "Please, just let me stay here for the night." Maya hesitated but nodded. "Of course. Come in." That night, Ratna told Maya everything, the market, the old woman, the strange occurrences. Maya listened in silence, her expression a mix of disbelief and concern. "You've been under a lot of stress," Maya said gently when Ratna finished. "Maybe you're imagining things." Ratna shook her head. "I'm not. It's real. You don't understand." Maya placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Stay here as long as you need. We'll figure this out." But as the night wore on, Ratna couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The whispers returned, faint but insistent, echoing in the corners of the room. When she finally drifted off to sleep, it was restless and plagued by nightmares. She dreamt of the doll, its glass eyes glowing red as it stood over her, whispering her name. She woke with a start, her heart racing. The room was dark, silent except for the sound of her own breathing. And then she saw it. In the corner of the room, illuminated by a sliver of moonlight, stood the doll. Its head was tilted, and its eyes glinted in the darkness. It had found her. Ratna screamed, waking Maya, who turned on the light. But when they looked back at the corner, the doll was gone. Ratna's hands shook as she pointed to the empty space. "It was there. I saw it." Maya's expression turned serious. "We need to get help. There's something wrong here." But deep down, Ratna knew no one could help her. The doll wasn't just an object. It was something else, something ancient, malevolent, and unstoppable. And it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. The next day, Ratna and Maya decided to seek help. They drove to a small temple on the outskirts of the city, known for its spiritual cleansing rituals. The priest there, an elderly man with a calm demeanor, listened intently as Ratna recounted her story. He didn't interrupt, nor did he dismiss her words as delusion. When she finished, the priest nodded gravely. "This is no ordinary doll," he said. "It is a vessel, a prison for a restless spirit. The bond has already been made, and it will not break easily." Ratna's hands gripped the edge of her chair. "How do I stop it?" she asked, desperation thick in her voice. The priest sighed. "The spirit is bound to the doll but feeds on your fear. The more you succumb to it, the stronger it becomes. To banish it, you must sever its connection to this world." "How do we do that?" Maya asked. "There is a ritual," the priest said. "It must be performed at the place where the doll was first encountered. But be warned, such spirits do not give up easily. It will resist." Ratna hesitated, her stomach twisting in knots. The thought of returning to the market made her skin crawl, but she knew she had no other choice. The priest gave them instructions for the ritual, which involved an offering of fire and sacred herbs to purify the spirit and send it to rest. He handed Ratna a small pouch of the herbs, along with a candle and a piece of red string. "Tie this string around the doll," he instructed. "It will bind the spirit temporarily, giving you time to complete the ritual. Do not delay, and whatever happens, do not look into its eyes." That evening, Ratna and Maya returned to the market. The atmosphere felt different now, heavier, darker. The once bustling alleys were eerily silent, the flickering lanterns casting long, distorted shadows. Ratna clutched the doll tightly in her arms, its cold porcelain pressing against her skin. She had found it sitting in her apartment again that morning, as if it knew what she was planning. She didn't speak as they walked, her eyes darting nervously at every shadow. Finally, they arrived at the stall where Ratna had first found the doll. The space was empty now, the old woman long gone. The air was icy cold, and an unnatural stillness hung over the area. "Here," Ratna whispered, setting the doll on the ground. Maya lit the candle while Ratna tied the red string around the doll's tiny body, her hands trembling. The moment the knot was secured, a sharp, piercing scream echoed through the alley. The sound wasn't human. It was guttural, otherworldly, and filled with rage. Ratna staggered backward, clutching her ears. The doll began to shake violently, its head snapping back and forth as if trying to break free from the string. The glass eyes glowed faintly, a sickly green light that made Ratna's stomach churn. "Start the ritual," Maya shouted, her voice barely audible over the wailing. Ratna fumbled with the pouch of herbs, scattering them in a circle around the doll. She began chanting the words the priest had taught her, her voice shaking but steady. As the chant grew louder, the doll's movements became more frantic. The ground beneath it began to crack, thin lines spreading outward like veins. Shadows swirled in the air, forming shapes that loomed over them, distorted faces with hollow eyes and mouths stretched wide in silent screams. The candle flickered violently, the flame struggling to stay lit. Maya reached out to steady Ratna, her own face pale with fear. "Don't stop," she urged. The doll let out another scream, louder this time, and its porcelain face began to crack. Dark liquid seeped from the fractures, pooling on the ground and hissing like acid. Ratna squeezed her eyes shut, her voice rising as she chanted faster. The final words of the chant left her lips, and she threw a handful of herbs into the flame. The fire roared to life, engulfing the doll in an intense, blinding heat. The wailing reached a deafening pitch, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Silence fell over the alley. The shadows receded, and the air grew still. When Ratna opened her eyes, the doll was gone. In its place was a small pile of ash, smoldering faintly. "It's over," Maya said softly, her voice shaking. Ratna collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face. The weight that had pressed on her chest for days was finally gone. In the weeks that followed, Ratna slowly began to rebuild her life. The nightmares ceased, and the whispers no longer haunted her. She never returned to the market, and she avoided anything that reminded her of the doll. But sometimes, late at night, she would catch herself glancing at the shadows in the corner of her room, half expecting to see a pair of glassy eyes staring back at her. And though she told herself it was over, a small part of her could never quite forget the feeling of being watched. For the doll was gone, yes, but the memory of it lingered, a silent reminder that some things are better left undisturbed.